Hello, my name's George Lawton. I'm a journalist for VentureBeat, and I'm here today with Craig Douglas, who's a general partner with World Fund, and Thibault Castagne, who's the CEO and co-founder of Vianova. And Craig, today we're going to talk about micromobility, where it's at, where it's going. Craig has been analyzing the current state of the tools for improving sustainability. How are we going to get the CO2 out of the air, and where different kinds of techniques, tools, services are making a difference and where they're not. And Thibault has been gathering the data to inform these kind of discussions. So maybe we could start with, tell us about your background and sort of, what you do and how that applies to micromobility.
Sure. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm from World Fund, so it's a 350 million climate tech venture fund, and we look for companies that can save at least 100 megatons of CO2 per year. So that's the potential behind every company that we invest in. So we invest across all the major CO2 emitting sectors, one of which obviously is transportation, and one of the potentially enabling technologies could be micromobility or actually integrated systems. So hence why I'm here, hence why we're chatting. But my background is technical, physics and chemistry, energy consultancy, and over 10 years investing in climate tech. So a reasonable amount of history in this space.
Thibault?
Yeah, so hi everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. So I'm Thibault Castagne. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Vianova. It's a Paris and London-based startup specialized in data analytics for smart cities and transportation. So we've been running since early 2019. Basically, in the context of this talk, we've been basically working with 70 cities so far across Europe on providing shared mobility management tool. So they can actually aggregate all the data from all the shared micromobility operators, and they have basically analytics or control or regulation tools, so they can direct operators where they can park or no park, get real-time enforcement notifications on where the vehicles are parking correctly, get analytics about where to set up mobility hubs to improve multimodal behavior between public transport and micromobility. And so yeah, we've seen a huge change actually in the sector, in the last couple of years. I think, on the numbers side, so across our cities we saw actually twofold increase in terms of ridership between last year and this year. I think what happened also what happened this summer obviously is that from a capital and equity perspective, I think a lot of these operators took a hit. So a lot of them basically had to get more profitable and had to exit some of the markets. To give you basically another sort of data point about shared micromobility, you got to be above 2 or 3 number of trips per vehicle per day to be profitable. And we see that that's the case in a lot of the large cities that have very good infrastructure for micromobility. But in other sort of tier 2, tier 3 cities, or cities where you don't have the right infrastructure for parking or for cycling lanes, where this is a struggle for the adoption. Yeah.
So where is micromobility today? I mean, it came out, we had the scooters, you had people riding on sidewalks. Are they making a difference yet, and why or why not?
Sure. Maybe to start here. In terms of micromobility has kind of two heads, unfortunately. One that, if you do it well, is massively CO2 saving. If you do it badly, it cannibalizes city infrastructure, whether that's out there in the market, like physical space, going down pavements, or it's cannibalizing metro rides, bus rides, and the like, in which case you're actually having a negative effect on the climate. You're utilizing existing resources, lowering the revenue per bus, and making it actually a worse situation. Now that's kind of one head. Now, if you do the integration well, and it works in harmony with the existing systems, then actually it has a very positive effect. So kind of where it is today, still very much in both worlds. But Thibault has probably got more data on that than I do.
Well, Thibault, tell us about the data. Where is it making a difference, and what kind of a difference is it making?
Yes, so I think, I mean, first of all, I think not all the cities are equal in terms of adoption to micromobility. I guess, the main factor for micromobility to strive is regulation and infrastructure, right? So, and obviously the purchasing power in the city. But again, you're not gonna basically deploy micromobility and have a high adoption in a city that is fully car-centric. So if you look at Los Angeles, for instance, who would actually drive, who would ride a bicycle or a scooter in the main highways in LA, right? No one. So I think for that, European cities are much more ahead because they were designed basically much more people-centric than car-centric. But still, the largest trouble that you have at the moment with micromobility is the space. So space is it's a huge trouble for micromobility operators to deploy their vehicles, and cities are basically struggling also around public order. And this is very politicized debate about how do you remove on-street parking space that basically provide revenue to the city authority. Versus micromobility devices where the fees system to cities is not really clear yet, right? So, but what we're seeing across all the cities that we work with is that there is an intention basically to move from a floating system to a parking fixed system, where basically little by little basically they are setting up these drop-off zones in cities. So for instance, in Paris, you've got 15,000 drop-off zones now. So they're moving to this parking based system, which helps a lot as long as they're enough dense not to degrade the user experience, right? But the industry, I think, they made a lot of efforts, right? And I think one of the examples that I would give is around the battery swapping. So battery swapping, if you don't have a battery swapping, you got to come with your van and you have to basically chunk all the scooters and bicycles basically in the van, go outside of Paris in the warehouse, charge the vehicle most of the time with diesel-powered vans. So from a sustainability perspective, that's.
So you're talking about
right.
Bikes when you say battery swapping, not cars.
Bicycles and scooters. So now you have battery swapping, which basically also reduce their cost for charging by 80%.
Now, can you capture the data about that? When it's battery swapped versus having to drive the vehicle somewhere and bring them back? Or is that something that, a work in progress of capturing all of those?
Yeah, so we've got a battery status, right? But most of the operators out there have battery swapping now. I think the only one basically that don't have it, unfortunately, today is Bird. And that's probably why they had to pull out from quite a few markets because obviously from an operational profitability perspective, then they're suffering from that.
And a sustainability perspective.
Yeah. But I think I would trigger the attention on a new study that was actually done by Fraunhofer Institute in German. So excuse me for my German accent, but they basically studied the impact of shared micromobility from a carbon perspective, right? They studied it in 6 cities: Düsseldorf, Berlin, Sydney, Melbourne, Seattle, Paris, and I think Oslo. And what they found is that overall, basically, it was a net carbon reduction, using micromobility, right? And another study went from meant that 55% of the mode that was replaced was actually walking and public transport, but that means the other 45% is ride-hailing and individual combustion cars, right? And so overall, it has actually a positive impact from a sustainability perspective. I think when we discuss also this matter, we have to think about it from a holistic perspective, as a whole transport system, right? So including public transport and including the whole life cycle of the engine of the devices themselves. Yeah.
So you were talking earlier, Craig, about there's mobility and then there's the integration pieces. And then there's other companies too you're analyzing, like how do they reduce their carbon impact? I think backstage you said you were shooting for 100 megatons reduction for each of your hits. How does like the integration kind of companies, the micromobility companies compare with each other and then also with other folks in this space?
Yeah, whether micromobility could ever really get to the scale to hit 100 megatons. Thibault and I have this discussion.
I was looking for funding at the time.
In my previous fund. So in terms of what's the actual impact that you can have or not have with regards to these sort of solutions. Now here, it has to be part of a broader solution. It can't by itself make the amount of savings that we would be interested in backing. It has to be part of an integrated play. So it has to be part of a better public or a more integrated transportation hubs in cities. It has to be part of an integration with other modalities of transportation. If you can do that, then it's definitely one part of a solution of an integrated transport system that is much more climate friendly, but in and of itself, whether it's positive or negative depends on its deployment and how it's managed, both from an individual company perspective, example with Bird, or how it's actually integrated into the city's architectures. And if it's integrated well, then it's an amazing part of the transportation infrastructure. I think what we're seeing, or what we could see from the next generation of micromobility, what's the next step to make it more impactful, but also potentially more working for the cities, is getting it out there into not just the central cities, but getting it more out into the distributed urban areas. But there, the relative profitability of that is lower, but potentially the impact of it is higher. So what you're actually then replacing is a definite car journey rather than a walking journey. So in those sort of environments, there's probably a lot of incentives for the city to try and push for that type of integration, even if it doesn't make financial sense for the operators today. So I think the next step that hopefully the data will show is what the relative benefits are of doing that, and again, hopefully longer term, actually making it a good financial opportunity for the operators to run.
Yeah.
But
so actually, if you look on our website to make a bit of advertising, so Vianova.io, you can look actually at the study we did with Amsterdam, where we looked at how do you actually optimize CO2, or actually how do you reduce CO2 with the right mobility hubs and cycling lanes planning, right? So we did a whole simulation optimizing basically a CO2 reduction with new mobility hubs and cycling lanes, right? So that means from a data perspective, you can actually achieve these 20% reduction goals by 2030, and even become carbon neutral for a lot of these cities. But I think what we need to be, as you mentioned, a micromobility will not be profitable everywhere, right? And there will need to be subsidized indirectly or directly. So indirectly, that means so subsidizing indirectly, it means the same thing as with cars. Why cars have so many parking spots in the city. That means that the city is basically indirectly subsidizing the car industry. Basically.
So a parking spot is a form of subsidy.
Of course.
So rather than just framing the conversation, we're going to give subsidies for these scooters. It's no, we're going to adjust the balance between cars, which is something we want less of, in the scooters.
So you basically the space allocation in cities is a direct correlation with your modal mix, right? So obviously, if you only have space for cars, then everyone's gonna drive cars, right? So who actually would go on a bicycle or scooter if you can't park it anywhere in a secure way, if you can't actually ride it in a secure way? So that's an indirect subsidy. You also have direct subsidy from government, for corporate cars. So corporate cars today, in a lot of countries like Belgium, like France, the Netherlands, are still subsidized. So there's still fiscal incentives, right? Now that you have new forms of subsidies, basically. For instance, in France, you have something called forfait mobilité durable, 700 euros per year that you can spend basically on sustainable mobility options, right? So that's a way basically to change the subsidy paradigm, from the car industry to the new mobility world, to the new sustainable mobility world, and making sure that it also becomes cheaper to opt for this sustainable option.
And certain cities are doing that very well. I mean, areas which already have a high level of micromobility or cycling already are gearing more and more towards that. Like Amsterdam, where I live, where I used to live in the center of Amsterdam, they just got rid of all the car parking on the streets, and you can only park a bike in front of your house, right? Like if you do that, people just get rid of cars. The only cars that are in that area are shared mobility, so large cars that you can share the same way you would a scooter. Now, the entire of Amsterdam is really geared towards that because it's ultra high urban density and an awful transportation infrastructure for cars. Like it's awful to drive in the city. You never want to do it if you have the option. But that's one city. But this is where one city versus another city, there's not a one size fits all at the moment.
What do you, both of you, what do you think are some of the ways that we can bring information together in a way where you can see the impact of changes? Like, if we put this kind of scooter solution in, if we extend micromobility out to the edges, whether it's scooters or some of these like mini self-driving cars, or if we get rid of parking spaces, which, it might be very unpopular, but if you can go in and you say, look, if we get rid of the parking spaces, we're going to cut CO2 by 100 megatons in Amsterdam, like, it would be like a selling point. Like, what's the state of the tools for making these kind of analysis today, and where do you think people that gather the data and then people that think about the investments can do to sort of improve the state of digital twins for mobility?
I want to entirely pass the buck here because when we've been looking at companies previously in the mobility space, actually Thibault was the one that I went to ask, is this a sensible thing for us to be doing? So data, that's your realm.
Yeah, so I would say so there's, for me, there's 3 blockers at the moment. One is that you have to source the data, and basically you have a lot of different providers. Even the city subcontractors, sometimes in many agreements, basically, like whether it's street lightings, like charging point operators, like don't actually have like data sharing in place in the agreement. So, let alone actually creating a digital twin if you actually don't have the data itself. I think the second aspect is the education, the data education that you have to do on cities. I think they're coming a long way. So now that they did very well, but I think there's still more skills to be basically like, and you also have to build products that are very like user-centric. So for them, it's easy to like make decisions basically based on data. And I think the other part where, I think you guys have done an amazing job with is CO2 accounting. So CO2 accounting is, how do you, from a city perspective, from a private organization perspective, like how do you, make the right decisions basically to reduce CO2? And I think the methodology of calculating CO2 is very, very hard. If you look at this paper from Fraunhofer Institute, the way they compute that, so they fuse the modal shift survey with like the life cycle assessment and put it together and look at the reduction basically in these 6 cities. So it's a lot of work, and we have to automatize this work, But you guys did it quite well already to some extent, yeah.
Yeah, well, we always look at the long-term potential, right? Yeah. So it's easier to look in some ways at the long-term potential. One of the other things I was particularly here at Web is we're promoting Project Frame, where you can actually download, look at all these tools. They're all open, available. You can look at what the long-term potential is of any technology that you might be interested in from a climate perspective.
Oh, so you have this on your website today.
This is Project Frame. The Prime Coalition and World Fund are one of the biggest supporters of this this framework. We're both on the steering group, working groups, and we're publicizing this as go on, sign up. You can download all of these tools for free. You can actually see what the long-term potential is behind every different technology bucket.
Project Frame.
Project Frame, yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.